2 out with Konerko up. And he rips one into left. Konerko, grand slam.
Okay, so here's Paul's attempt at hitting a home run, and he is using none other than
the patriarch of all patriarchs, the man, the myth, the legend, Father Abraham.
So Paul opens up chapter 4 by literally asking, what about Father Abraham? Because after all, he wasn't made right with God by the law, so how exactly is he saved? See, Paul makes some very valid points here and is making his argument of salvation by faith even more concrete. First off, he opens up by quoting Genesis 15, verse 6, where it says, and he, talking about Abraham, believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. Now, why is this important? And I want us to stop right here for just a second, because I want you to kind of understand something. See, Paul is taking the scriptures very literal, and he is following a timeline, and that's important to understand. So to help you, let's break things down real quick. Okay, so Abraham believes God and was considered righteous. That's Genesis 15. So Abraham is now justified by faith in Genesis chapter 15. Okay, now raise your hand if you have ever heard that circumcision is sort of an important deal in Judaism. I mean, if Jesus was circumcised, it's kind of a huge deal, you know? So the sign of being a Jew, or one of God's chosen people back in those days, was circumcision. And it was mandatory. And it was a pretty big deal, like kicked out of Judaism type big deal if you didn't want to go through with it. I mean, did I mention this was a big deal? It's kind of a big deal, you know? So now the command to begin circumcision as a sign was given in Genesis 17, verse 10. So now, and pay attention, circumcision was considered a sign of the promise or covenant God made to Israel. That is repeated throughout Genesis, but more specifically and initially in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. This promise or covenant is called the Abrahamic covenant, and it promised 3 things: to make them a great people, to give them a land, and to redeem or bless them. So then let me ask you a question. So when Abraham was made righteous by faith, was the sign of circumcision given yet? That's right, the answer is no. That didn't happen until 2 chapters later. So remember the timeline that I spoke about? Because that's important, like I said. So the promise made that all nations will be blessed through Abraham is given in Genesis chapter 12. He is made righteous in chapter 15 and the circumcised in chapter 17. So that means that the promise of God that all nations will be blessed because of Abraham's covenant with God was prior to the sign of circumcision. In other words, it was always faith, and therefore Jews and Gentiles have always been saved by faith. See, if Abraham would have received the sign of circumcision in, let's say, Genesis chapter 14, then saved by faith in 15, the Gentiles wouldn't have made it. And Paul's argument would have failed. But because circumcision, which again was a distinguishing factor between Jews and Gentiles, was given after he was saved, this means everyone is saved by the grace of God through faith, and not because of an outward appearance or sign or someone's special deed. Makes sense? You see, it's always been by faith, even in the Old Testament. So let's think about it another way. When and by whom was the law given? By Moses from God nearly 600 or so years later after Abraham. So how could Abraham have been justified or made righteous by the law if the law had not yet been given? See how time plays a factor in this? Okay, so let's keep going and understand what Abraham really had faith in. First, Abraham had faith in the promise God made him, but let's kind of look at the circumstances here, just as Paul did. God promised Abraham that he would become a great nation, despite the fact that he was 100 years old. And by the way, his wife Sarah, she was 90. I mean, how many 90-year-old women walk around having kids? So they go on and have a child named Isaac at 90 years old, who becomes the seed bearer for the Messianic line. In other words, Abraham's faith in God's promise was his home run. Now keep the idea that Isaac was the seed of the promise in your mind, especially when we get to Romans chapter 9, because that's huge. But for today, that's all for now. Chapter 5 is tomorrow, and I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day. Bye-bye.